When desperation knocks, morality can't always answer. For 15 years, I lived 5 different lives with 5 different husbands in 5 neighboring towns. Nobody knew until everything collapsed in a single day. Hello, my dears. I'm Eleanor Thompson. I'm 78 years old today. If you're watching this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing my stories reach so many different places across America. Today, I'll share a story I've kept secret for over 40 years. A story of desperation, wrong choices, but also survival. I'm not proud of what I did, but I can't deny it's what kept me and my children alive. It all began in 1972. I was 25 years old with 3 small children, Ryan, 6 years old, Melissa, 4, and little Tyler, just 2. My husband, August, worked as a farm equipment salesman. At least that's what he claimed. I believed him throughout 7 years of marriage, until one day I returned from the grocery store to find our house empty. Not only had he disappeared, but he took everything of value, our meager savings from under the mattress, the small jewelry set I inherited from my mother, even our best cookware. On the kitchen table was just a hastily written note. I can't continue with this life. Don't look for me. Those words tore my soul apart. It wasn't just abandonment, but betrayal and cowardice. I stood there, with hungry children crying around me, not knowing what to do. Back then, an abandoned woman was seen as a failure. I returned to my parents' home in rural Kentucky, but my father, a strict countryman, received me with harsh words. You've dishonored our family twice. First by getting pregnant before marriage, and now by being abandoned. There's no place for you here. I stayed just one night sleeping in the barn with my children. The next morning, I took what little I had and left. With 3 small children, no money, and no family support, desperation began to take over. I secured a room in the back of a small boarding house in exchange for washing laundry and cleaning rooms. The children stayed alone while I worked. At night, I would sew clothes for extra money, using an old machine the boarding house owner lent me. I slept only 3 hours a night, but even so, the money barely fed my children. That's when Ryan, my oldest, got sick. A fever that wouldn't break, a cough that wouldn't stop. The doctor said it was pneumonia and needed expensive medication. In that moment, looking at my son's pale little face, I felt I would do anything to save him. At the boarding house, I met a traveler, Mr. Anthony, who owned a small grocery store in the neighboring town, about 20 miles from where we were. He always came to town to buy merchandise and stayed at the boarding house. He was a middle-aged widower with no children. He began to notice me, bringing small gifts for the children. One day, he offered to help with Ryan's medicine. "A beautiful woman like you shouldn't go through such hardships," he would say. When he proposed I live with him as his wife, I saw a chance for survival. There was no love, only necessity. I accepted, but with one condition, that I could continue working with my sewing. He agreed as long as I kept the house well and was a good wife. I moved to his town, Millfield, and began calling myself Ellie, my middle name that almost nobody knew. Anthony wasn't a bad man, but he was controlling. He counted every penny and questioned every expense. The money I earned from sewing went almost entirely to the children's medicine and to secretly save a little. My small emergency fund that he didn't know existed. 6 months later, even with a guaranteed roof, food on the table, and the children in school, I realized the money was still insufficient. Ryan needed ongoing treatment for his lungs, and the other 2 had their needs too. That's when the idea came that would change my life forever. A sewing client who owned a small beauty salon in Riverdale, a town 15 miles from Millfield, mentioned her sister was looking for someone to make party dresses. "She pays very well but needs the seamstress to come there for fittings." This was the opportunity I needed. I started going to Riverdale once a week, telling Anthony I was buying special fabrics. Soon my sewing became famous in town, and that's where I met Gerald, owner of a small shoe factory. A younger, single man enchanted by my made-up stories about being a young widow from New York who came to the countryside to start over. To him, I was Celia, the name of a distant cousin who died young. When Gerald proposed marriage 6 months later, I saw another chance to increase our financial security. I created a careful routine: 3 days in Millfield with Anthony, 3 days in Riverdale with Gerald, and 1 day buying fabrics, which was actually when I organized everything and rested a little. The children stayed in a semi-boarding Catholic school that Anthony paid for, thinking it was an act of generosity, not knowing it was exactly what I needed to keep my scheme working. I visited them on the 2 permitted days each week, alternating between my 2 identities. The hardest part wasn't maintaining the lies, but living with the guilt. Each night, lying beside a man who believed he was my only husband, I silently cried, asking God for forgiveness. But then I remembered my children's faces, how they were healthier, better fed, with access to education, and told myself the end justified the means. The scheme worked for almost a year. I had created an impeccable routine, consistent stories, and even different appearances. With Anthony, I was the simple housewife, hair always tied back, modest clothes. With Gerald, I was more modern, wearing light makeup, loose hair, and clothes I sewed with a more contemporary touch. Then came the drought of 1974. Anthony's grocery store began to suffer as customers, mostly farmers, had no money to spend. His moods worsened, and with them came the first instances of abuse, verbal at first, then physical. The first time he raised his hand to me was when I questioned why he was drinking so much. The slap was so hard I fell to the kitchen floor. "You're nobody to question me. If it weren't for me, you and those children of yours would be on the street," he shouted with his finger pointed at my face. That night, I locked myself in the bedroom with the children and cried myself to sleep. The next day, he acted as if nothing had happened, and so did I. What else could I do? The abuse became more frequent. I hid the bruises with long-sleeved clothes and makeup when I went to Riverdale. Gerald, on the other hand, was kind, but had his own issues. He was obsessive about control. He wanted to know where I was every minute of the day. He called repeatedly when I said I was home sewing. It was during this period that I met Sebastian in Greenwood, the 3rd town in my circuit. A fabric merchant, he frequented the same fairs as me when I bought materials. To him, I was Carmen, a seamstress with Spanish heritage. I even created a slight accent to complete the farce. Sebastian was a generous, outgoing man who quickly became enchanted with me. Unlike the other two, Sebastian was neither controlling nor abusive. His problem was pathological jealousy. Even so, when he invited me to be his companion and manage his fabric store, I saw an opportunity to escape Anthony's abuse and Gerald's surveillance. Besides, working with fabrics would be perfect for my sewing trade. I adapted my routine again. Now it was 2 days with each of the 3 men and 1 day for organization. The children continued at boarding school, increasingly distant from me. This broke my heart, but I repeated to myself that it was all for them, to secure their future. The guilt grew inside me. Sometimes I woke up in the middle of the night, suffocating, as if the weight of lies was crushing me. I began having frequent nightmares where I was discovered, dragged through the streets, stoned by the crowd. In other dreams, I saw my children being taken away, calling for help while I was imprisoned, unable to reach them. The money I managed to save went into a bank account in a 4th town, Clearwater, where I began building a small house, my escape plan for when the children were older and I could finally stop this life of lies. It was during one of my visits to Clearwater that I met Nelson, a professor at the local technical school. A cultured, refined man who became enchanted with my stories about literature, all learned from books I devoured in the few free hours I had. To him, I was Regina, a widowed elementary school teacher building a new life away from painful memories. Nelson represented everything I dreamed of being: educated, respected in the community, able to talk about any subject. When he asked for a commitment 6 months later, I couldn't refuse. I adapted my routine again, reducing time with each of the other men. By this point, in 1976, I was living 4 different lives, with 4 different names, 4 different wardrobes, 4 different ways of speaking and behaving. It was as if I had divided myself into 4 distinct women, each playing a different role. The exhaustion was immense, but the fear of being discovered was even greater. The children were growing up. Ryan, at 10, was starting to ask difficult questions. Why did we move so much? Why did I disappear for days? Why did we have to lie about our past? I invented stories about a dangerous ex-husband who was pursuing us, about the need to hide. The guilt consumed me every time I saw the confusion in his eyes. On a rainy afternoon in 1977, while returning from Clearwater to Millfield, the bus I was on had a minor accident. Nothing serious, just a few scratches in my case, but enough for me to be taken to the hospital for examinations. That's where I met Joaquin, a newly graduated doctor who treated my injuries. Joaquin was different from the others, quiet, shy, but with a gaze that seemed to see through me. When he invited me for coffee after my discharge, I accepted more out of politeness than interest. I wasn't planning to start a 5th relationship, but Joaquin had something the others didn't. He seemed genuinely interested in me, not in what I could do for him. To Joaquin, I was Louise, a nurse who worked in neighboring towns. Our relationship began as friendship, but soon became something more. He lived in Lakeside, the 5th town in my personal circuit. When he proposed we live together after just 3 months, I saw not just another source of financial security, but perhaps a chance for true affection. I reorganized my life once more. Now it was approximately a day and a half with each man, with constant travel between the 5 towns. The exhaustion was absurd. I began losing weight and having health problems. My hair started falling out. My nails broke easily. Sometimes I woke up confused, not immediately knowing which name to answer to, which house I was in. It was during this period, in 1979, after almost 7 years living multiple lives, that I realized I was trapped in a snare I had created myself. What began as a desperate survival strategy had transformed into a prison. I couldn't simply abandon these lives. Each of those men knew a part of me. Each could report me, destroy me. Many times I thought about running away, taking the children, and disappearing. But where to? With what money? And what future would my children have? Always running, always hiding? No, I needed to continue, at least until Ryan finished his studies and could work, until all 3 were set on their path in life. What I didn't know was that fate had other plans for me, plans that would involve an unexpected pregnancy, an accident, and an encounter that would change everything. The year was 1980. I had been living this way for almost 8 years. My children were growing up, Ryan at 14, Melissa at 12, and Tyler at 10. They continued in the semi-boarding school, coming home only on weekends, alternating between the 5 towns where I maintained my different lives. For them, I had created a story about working as an itinerant nurse, caring for patients in various locations. That year, I noticed something that left me in total panic. My period was late. At 33, I initially thought it might be the beginning of early menopause, a result of the absurd stress I lived with daily. But when the morning sickness began, there was no more denying it. I was pregnant. The discovery left me paralyzed with terror. A pregnancy would be impossible to hide or explain. How would I justify a growing belly to the other 4 husbands? How would I explain the baby afterwards? And worst of all, I wasn't even sure who the father was. I mentally calculated several times. By the date of my last period, the baby could only be Nelson's, the professor, or Joaquin's, the doctor. Regardless of which of the 2 was the father, I wouldn't be able to maintain my scheme functioning much longer. I cried for entire nights, hidden in the bathroom so no one would hear me. I considered all possibilities: abortion, which was and still is illegal, telling the truth to one of the men and running away with him, or simply disappearing alone. Each option seemed worse than the other. I decided I would tell Joaquin, the doctor. Among all of them, He seemed the most understanding and, being in healthcare, might be able to help me with the pregnancy without too many questions. I planned everything carefully. I would gradually end things with the other four, inventing stories about family illnesses that would force me to move far away. But life has a cruel way of unraveling our plans. The same week I decided to tell Joaquin, Anthony, my first husband, the grocery store owner, had a stroke. I couldn't abandon him at that moment. It would be inhumane. I decided to postpone my plans and care for him while he was ill. At the same time, Gerald, the shoe manufacturer, was having serious financial problems and talking about selling everything and starting over in another town. Sebastian, the fabric merchant, was more jealous than ever, questioning every minute I spent away from home. And Nelson, the professor, had just given me an engagement ring, wanting to formalize our union. My life was falling apart on all fronts, and the pregnancy advancing. I started wearing looser clothes, talking about gaining weight due to age. Luckily, if I can call it that, I never had very large bellies in my previous pregnancies, and this one was no different. In the 5th month, when the belly was more visible, I invented a story about a kidney problem causing abdominal swelling. I even showed falsified medical prescriptions to anyone who questioned. The problem was that this lie required others: exams, consultations, special medications. That's when I had the idea to use the fictional illness as an excuse to spend more time in Lakeside, Joaquin's town, claiming there was a kidney specialist there. This would give me time to plan my definitive escape, gather enough money, and decide where to go. In the 6th month of pregnancy, on a rainy Sunday in October 1980, I was traveling from Millfield to Lakeside on the intercity bus. The path crossed a dangerous mountain range with sharp curves. That day, with the wet road, the driver lost control on one of the curves. The bus didn't flip over, but hit violently against the guardrail. I was thrown against the seat in front of me. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, as if 1,000 knives were being plunged into my womb. I felt a warm liquid running down my legs and knew immediately. Something was terribly wrong with the baby. When the ambulance arrived, I was semi-conscious. I vaguely heard the paramedics discussing which hospital to take me to. By a stroke of cruel fate, they decided on St. Vincent Regional Hospital, the only one in the region equipped for obstetric emergencies, the same hospital where Joaquin worked, which served patients from all 5 towns where I maintained my secret lives. At the hospital, between flashes of consciousness and unconsciousness, I remember hearing my name called many times, but different names. Mrs. Thompson? Mrs. Ellie, can you hear me? Looking for Celia. The confusion was total. The ID in my purse showed the name Louise. I was taken straight to the operating room. The baby was in fetal distress. They needed to perform an emergency C-section. Before being anesthetized, I grabbed a nurse's arm and whispered, "My children, at St. Mary's boarding school. Let them know." It was my last conscious thought before darkness. I woke hours later, still groggy from anesthesia. The first thing I did was touch my belly. It was empty. I panicked, trying to get up, wanting to know about my baby. A nurse calmed me, saying the baby girl, yes, it was a girl, was in the NICU, premature, but stable. That's when I noticed the strange atmosphere in the room. The nurse avoided looking into my eyes, seeming uncomfortable. There's someone who wants to see you," she said hesitantly. "Actually, there are several people, but we don't know who to authorize." My blood froze. I tried to sit up, ignoring the searing pain from the recent surgery. "Who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Well, there's a gentleman who says he's your husband, Anthony, and another who also claims to be your husband, Gerald, and a third, Sebastian. All brought documents, and all are quite agitated, demanding explanations. The house of cards I'd built over 8 years was collapsing all at once. There was no more running, no more lying. The moment of truth had arrived in the worst possible way. "And Joaquin and Nelson?" I asked in an almost inaudible voice. The nurse frowned, confused. "Dr. Joaquin is on duty today. He performed your surgery, As for Nelson, I don't know anyone by that name who's come looking for you." The cruel irony of fate. The man I had planned to tell about my pregnancy ended up being the doctor who brought my daughter into the world without knowing she was his, or at least potentially his. At that moment, I heard shouting in the corridor, angry male voices demanding explanations, accusing each other of insanity. "She's my wife!" shouted a voice I recognized as Anthony's. "You're crazy. Celia has been my fiancée for more than 5 years," Gerald responded. The door to the room opened violently. 3 men entered at once, followed by hospital security trying to contain them. Anthony, Gerald, and Sebastian, 3 of my 5 husbands, face to face for the first time, all looking at me with a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. The silence that followed was deafening. 5, 10, 15 seconds where nobody said anything, just staring at me in the hospital bed, pale, still connected to tubes and monitors. It was Sebastian who spoke first, with a voice trembling with emotion. "Carmen, or whatever your real name is, what does this mean?" At that instant, the door opened again. It was Joaquin, still dressed in his surgeon's scrubs, holding a clipboard. Seeing the scene, he froze. "Louise, what's happening here?" 4 men, 4 different lives, all converging on that hospital room, that moment of brutal revelation. Only Nelson was missing, who probably didn't yet know about the accident, and I silently thanked for that. "I can explain," I began, but the words died in my throat. How to explain 8 years of lies? How to justify the double, triple, quintuple lives I led? There was no explanation that could soften that multiple betrayal. The security guards finally managed to convince the men to leave the room. An older doctor, apparently Joaquin's superior, came in and gave me a sedative, saying I needed to rest, that the confusion could wait until I had recovered from the surgery. But we all knew there would be no complete recovery from this. My life, as I knew it, was over. In the weeks that followed, the scandal spread like wildfire through all 5 towns. "The woman with 5 husbands," they called me. I was the topic of conversation in bars, beauty salons, churches. The stories became increasingly exaggerated with each retelling. They said I had stolen fortunes from my husbands, that I had children with each of them, that I was part of a strange religious cult. My children suffered the worst impact. They were removed from boarding school. No one wanted children associated with that scandal. Ryan, at 14, became taciturn, refusing to speak to me. Melissa cried constantly, asking why we had to be hated by everyone. Only Tyler, with his childlike innocence at 10 years old, still looked at me without judgment. I was evicted from the house I shared with each of the men. None of them wanted to hear me out. None wanted to know my reasons. To them, I was just a con artist, a liar, a woman without morals or scruples. The final blow came when Child Protective Services, which was just beginning to be structured in America at that time, opened a case to take custody of my children. They claimed I lacked the moral capacity to raise them, that I was a pernicious influence, a bad example. In the midst of this chaos, my newborn daughter, whom I named Claire, because amidst so much darkness, she was my only light, was fighting for her life in the NICU. Born at 8 months, weighing only 4 pounds, her lungs weren't fully developed. The doctors didn't give much hope. I visited Claire every day, facing the looks of contempt from the hospital staff. I sat beside the incubator and talked to her for hours, asking her to be strong, to fight, promising I would find a way to fix everything, to give her and her siblings a dignified, honest life. During one of these visits, I found Joaquin in the NICU. He looked at me for a long time, without saying anything. Then he approached Claire's incubator. "She has the same eye shape I had as a baby," he finally said in a low voice. My mother kept photographs. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. "Why?" he asked after a long silence. "Why do this to us? We were 5 men who trusted you, who opened our hearts, our homes." Tears ran down my face. "It didn't start as a plan," I murmured. "It started as desperation. A woman alone with 3 small children to feed in 1972. You can't imagine what that's like. I told him everything right there, beside the incubator where our daughter fought for her life. I spoke of the abandonment, my family's rejection, Ryan's illness, the impossible choices I had to make. I spoke of the constant fear, the guilt that corroded me, the plans I had to end it all and start an honest life. Joaquin listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sighed deeply. I can't say I understand or forgive, but I know Claire will need us both, and your other children need you too. It was the first extended hand amid the disaster, the first glimpse that perhaps, just maybe, there was a path to redemption for me. But that path would be long and painful. I lost temporary custody of my 3 older children, who were sent to a temporary shelter. Claire remained in the NICU with an uncertain prognosis. I was homeless, penniless, with a destroyed reputation in 5 different towns. It was at this lowest point that I found an unlikely ally, Sister Constance, a nun who ran the laundry at St. Vincent Hospital. She saw me crying in the hospital chapel one night after another visit to the NICU. "The Lord forgives all sins, my child," she said, sitting beside me. "And if He can forgive, who are we not to forgive?" Sister Constance offered me a small room at the back of the convent and work in the laundry. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A roof, food on the table, and the chance to be near my daughter as she fought for her life. The nuns welcomed me without judgment, something I hadn't experienced in a long time. And it was there, sorting dirty sheets and operating industrial washing machines, that I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. Claire improved slowly, gaining weight, growing stronger. After 3 months in the NICU, I could finally hold her in my arms, without tubes or wires. It was a miracle, a second chance I didn't deserve, but for which I was infinitely grateful. Now, with Claire in my arms and a roof over our heads, my next battle would be to regain my other children. But for that, I would need to face not just the judicial system, but also my own past in a trial where all my lies would be exposed, where I would have to look into the eyes of the men I deceived and ask, if not for forgiveness, at least for understanding. The year was 1981, and my true journey of redemption was just beginning. The first months of 1981 were the darkest of my life. Living in the small room at the back of the convent, working in the hospital laundry under Sister Constance's protection, I lived for 2 things: caring for little Claire, who had finally left the NICU, and fighting to regain custody of my other 3 children. The social services system in the 80s was precarious, almost non-existent. My children were in a church-run shelter in the neighboring town. I could visit them only once a week, always under supervision. Those visits broke my heart. Ryan, my firstborn, now 15, refused to speak to me or even look me in the eyes. Melissa, at 13, cried constantly, alternating between desperately hugging me and accusing me of ruining their lives. Only Tyler, the youngest at 11, still maintained some sweetness with me, though his eyes revealed a deep sadness no child should carry. "When are we going home, Mom?" he asked me every week, and I had no answer. Which home? I no longer had a home to offer them. In April of that year, I received the summons I so feared. I would be tried for fraud, false identity, and even bigamy, although, technically, I had never officially married any of the 5 men. The trial would be in June at the county courthouse, which encompassed the 5 towns where I had lived my parallel lives. In the weeks leading up to the trial, I fell into a pit of despair. I had no money to hire a lawyer. The few savings I had managed to hide over the years had been used for Claire's care, who still needed specialized treatment for her lungs. It was Sister Constance who once again extended her hand to me. She knew a young, newly graduated lawyer who worked pro bono cases for the convent. "He's inexperienced, but has a good heart and a sharp mind," she told me. "And more importantly, he won't judge you for your mistakes, only for your motives." Dr. Paul was only 26 and had an idealism that only the very young can maintain intact. When we met for the first time in the convent's small library, he showed no contempt or judgment, just listened for hours on end as I recounted my entire story, from abandonment by my first husband to the accident that revealed everything. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Thompson," he said when I finished my account. "Your chances are slim. Society is very hard on women who deviate from their expected role, especially mothers. But we have some points in our favor." His plan was simple: deny nothing, but contextualize everything. Show that my actions, though morally questionable, were motivated by a mother's desperation trying to protect her children in a society that offered no alternatives for abandoned women. The day of the trial arrived with frightening speed. The courthouse was packed. My case had become a local sensation, fueling gossip and speculation for weeks. As I entered the room, I felt the weight of hundreds of judging gazes, and there they were, in the front row: Anthony, Gerald, Sebastian, and Nelson. Only Joaquin wasn't present. He had chosen not to file charges against me, a small gesture of mercy that meant the world at that moment. The prosecutor was merciless, painting me as a calculating con artist who manipulated honest, hard-working men to extort money and comfort. "This woman," he said, pointing at me with contempt, "represents everything that's wrong with the moral degradation of our society. She chose the path of lies, betrayal, deceit, when she could have worked honestly to support her children." When it was Dr. Paul's turn to speak, he surprised everyone with his eloquence. He didn't try to portray me as a saint, but as a desperate woman, abandoned by family, society, and the state, who made wrong choices driven by a mother's most basic instinct: to protect her children. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, "before you judge this woman, ask yourselves, what would you do if you were alone with 3 small children to feed, without formal education, without family support, in a country where single women are viewed as pariahs? What is the value of a lie compared to a child's hunger?" The hardest moment came when the men were called to testify. One by one, they recounted how they met me, how they believed my stories, how they opened their hearts and homes to me. The pain in their voices was palpable, and I kept my eyes down, unable to face them. Anthony, the oldest of the 5, was especially harsh. She made me believe I had finally found a companion for my old age after years of loneliness, he said, his voice breaking. I treated her as a wife, trusted her with my home, my business, and it was all a lie. Gerald spoke about the plans we had to expand the shoe factory, to build a life together. Sebastian revealed he had bought an engagement ring the week of the accident, planning to formally propose. Nelson, the professor, perhaps the most hurt of all, spoke about how I had destroyed not only his trust in me, but in all women. When it was my turn to speak, the courtroom was in absolute silence. I stood up with trembling legs, holding Claire in my arms. "Doctor." Paul had insisted I bring the baby to humanize my image before the jury. "I'm not here to deny what I did," I began, my voice almost fading, "nor to ask you to absolve me. I know what I did was wrong. I lied, I deceived, I betrayed the trust of good men who didn't deserve this." I paused, breathing deeply to contain the tears. "But I am also a mother. And when my first husband abandoned me with 3 small children, when my own family rejected me, when I couldn't find a job that paid enough to feed my children, I made a decision, a wrong decision, but one that at the time seemed the only way out. I told about Ryan's pneumonia, about how desperation led me to the first marriage with Anthony, about how one mistake led to another and another, until I found myself trapped in a web I had woven myself. I don't ask for forgiveness, I concluded, looking directly at the 4 men in the front row. I know I don't deserve it. I ask only for the chance to raise my children, to show them that a person can fall, can make terrible mistakes, but can also rise again, can seek redemption through an honest life. The verdict came the next day, guilty of fraud and false identity. The sentence, 3 years in prison, which was converted to 4 years of probation and community service. Considering I was the mother of 4 minor children, including a baby who needed special care. It was a more lenient sentence than I expected, but there was still the most important issue: custody of my children. The judge determined that I would retain temporary custody of Claire, since none of the possible fathers had contested paternity. But custody of the 3 older ones would be decided in a separate hearing after psychosocial evaluation. I left the courthouse that day with mixed feelings. I wouldn't go to prison, but I could still permanently lose my children. It was a partial victory, but the path to complete redemption still seemed almost impossible. In the months that followed, I dedicated myself entirely to proving I deserved a second chance. I continued working in the hospital laundry, now not just as part of my community service, but as a hired employee. Sister Constance had convinced the hospital administration to give me a permanent position with a small salary that allowed me to rent a larger room for Claire and me in the hospital neighborhood itself. I saved every penny, dreaming of someday having a home to reunite all my children. I visited Ryan, Melissa, and Tyler religiously every week, even when Ryan continued refusing to speak to me. I brought small gifts I could afford: a new notebook, colored pencils, a special candy. Slowly, very slowly, Melissa began to soften, to allow brief moments of connection. Tyler had never really distanced himself, but even he seemed to doubt we would ever be together again. In December 1981, I received an unexpected visit in the small room where I lived with Claire. It was Joaquin, the doctor, whom I hadn't seen since the days in the hospital after our daughter's birth. "I came to see how Claire is," he said formally, standing in the doorway, not accepting my invitation to enter. "And also to tell you I did the paternity test. The results came yesterday." My heart froze. Paternity testing in the 80s was a complicated procedure based on blood types, which didn't offer 100% certainty but could exclude possibilities. "She is my daughter," Joaquin finally said. "The blood type confirms it. Nelson is excluded as a possibility." I didn't know what to say. Part of me felt relief to finally know the truth. Another part feared what this would mean for my already precarious situation. "I didn't come to ask for custody," he continued, as if reading my thoughts. "I came to say I want to be part of her life and that I'm willing to help with all your children." It was the first time since the collapse of all my lies that someone offered me not just forgiveness, but concrete help. I cried openly, unable to control the emotions flooding me. Joaquin began visiting Claire regularly. He never stayed long, never mentioned our past or the lies I had told. We spoke only about the baby, her development, her needs. He brought diapers, formula, new clothes, small gestures that meant the world to me. In February 1982, the hearing to decide custody of my 3 older children took place. I had spent months preparing, gathering work documentation, statements from Sister Constance about my character and dedication, creating a small album with photos of the room I had prepared for them in the house I managed to rent. A modest place, but clean and welcoming. To my surprise, Joaquin attended the hearing, not as my partner — we never had that kind of relationship again — but as a doctor who attested to my commitment to Claire's welfare and my transformation as a person. "I've known Eleanor for almost 2 years," he told the judge. "I saw her at her lowest point, when all her lies were exposed, and I've seen her in recent months rebuild her life with honesty and dedication. She made serious mistakes, but she's paying for them and deserves the chance to be a mother to her children." His testimony weighed significantly in the judge's decision. At the end of the hearing, it was determined that I would regain custody of my children, but with supervision from Child Protective Services for at least a year, with monthly visits to ensure everything was well. The day I picked up Ryan, Melissa, and Tyler from the shelter was one of the happiest and also most tense of my life. Melissa ran into my arms, crying with joy. Tyler smiled as I hadn't seen him smile in a long time, but Ryan remained distant, sullen, carrying his small suitcase without saying a word. Our new home was small, just 2 bedrooms, a tiny living room, kitchen, and bathroom. The boys shared 1 bedroom, Melissa slept in the living room, and I stayed with Claire in the other bedroom. It wasn't ideal, but it was our home, earned through honest work. The first months were difficult. Ryan rarely spoke to me, leaving home early and returning late, spending as little time as possible in my presence. Melissa oscillated between moments of affection and explosions of teenage anger, throwing in my face all the mistakes I had made. Tyler tried to be the peacemaker, the perfect son, as if fearing any problem might separate us again. And Claire, my little Claire, grew oblivious to all this drama, smiling at everyone, winning over even Ryan's hardened heart, who, when he thought no one was looking, played with her, made faces to draw out her laughter. Joaquin remained present in Claire's life, visiting her regularly, taking her to spend a few hours with him on weekends. We developed a cordial relationship based on mutual respect and shared love for our daughter. He never demanded additional explanations, never threw my mistakes in my face, simply moved forward as I tried to do. I worked hard in the hospital laundry, doing overtime whenever possible. At night, I began taking in sewing work again, no longer to maintain parallel lives, but to supplement our income, to give my children small comforts we otherwise couldn't afford. One night in 1983, almost 2 years after the trial, Ryan entered my room while I was sewing by the light of a lamp. He was 17 then, almost a man, with features increasingly resembling the father who had abandoned him. "Why did you do it, Mom?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. It was the first time he had called me Mom since the scandal. I set down the dress I was sewing and looked at him. "Out of desperation," I answered honestly. "Out of fear of losing you, of not being able to support you, of seeing you suffer need." "Were there other ways?" he said without looking me in the eyes. Today I know there were, but back then, alone, without support, with 3 small children, I couldn't see them. We sat in silence for a long time. "I'm thinking of applying to medical school," he finally said, changing the subject. "Dr. Joaquin said he can help me with some books." The mention of Joaquin's name surprised me. I didn't know they maintained contact beyond the visits to Claire. "He's a good man," I commented cautiously. "Yes," Ryan agreed. He told me we all make mistakes, but what matters is what we do after them. That night, for the first time in years, I felt that perhaps, just maybe, there could be forgiveness for me, not just from justice or society, but from the people who mattered most, my children. The 1980s continued advancing, and with them, our family slowly healed. Ryan actually entered medical school with a partial scholarship and working as a nursing assistant to supplement. Melissa discovered a talent for drawing and began dreaming of a career in design. Tyler, always the calmest, excelled in school and talked about being a teacher like Nelson, he would say, although he had never met the man. And Claire, my youngest, born in the eye of the hurricane, grew healthy and happy, loved by all of us and by her father, who became a constant presence in her life and gradually in all our lives. As for me, I continued working in the hospital laundry, eventually being promoted to supervisor. I never became romantically involved with anyone again. The scars were too deep, the guilt still too present. I devoted myself entirely to my children and my work, finding a peace I never thought possible after the scandal that marked my life. The true test of our recovery as a family came in 1988, when I received an unexpected invitation. Joaquin was getting married, and he wanted Claire to be the flower girl. To my surprise, the invitation extended to our entire family. Melissa, then 20, was categorical. "I'm not going. It would be too strange." Ryan, already in his 3rd year of medical school, said he would go out of respect for Joaquin. Tyler, at 18, shrugged and said he would go if I went. I decided we should all go. It was a chance to show my children that people could move forward, build new lives without carrying the weight of the past forever. The wedding was in a small church in Lakeside. We sat discreetly in the back pews, trying not to draw attention. Claire, beautiful in her little white dress, performed her role as flower girl perfectly, throwing rose petals down the aisle. During the reception, Joaquin came to our table, accompanied by his new wife, Lucille, a nurse he had met at the hospital. "Thank you for coming," he said with a genuine smile. "It means a lot to me that Claire could share this day." Lucille, a woman with a kind face and gentle eyes, shook my hand without hesitation. "Joaquin told me everything," she said. "About the past, about you. I want you to know that Claire will always be welcome in our home, and so will you," she added, looking at my other children. At that moment, sitting at that wedding celebration, watching the man I had deceived find happiness with someone else, with my 4 children by my side, I felt the circle finally closing, not with a fairy tale happy ending, but with something better, real, imperfect redemption, earned through hard work, honesty, and perseverance. The journey had been long and painful, filled with mistakes, lies, and bitter consequences, but also with learning, growth, and finally, the chance to live a life without masks. Now, at 78, looking back, I'm not proud of what I did, but I am proud of what I became afterwards. A woman who faced her mistakes head-on, paid for them, and rebuilt her life on foundations of truth. The 1990s brought more changes for our family. Ryan graduated from medical school in 1993 at 27. I'll never forget the emotion of seeing him walk across the stage to receive his diploma, the first in our family to complete college. In the audience, besides me and his siblings, was Joaquin, who had become a sort of mentor to my oldest son over the years. Claire, then 12, proudly applauded the brother she so admired. Melissa followed her artistic talent and secured a job at a small advertising agency after completing a technical design course. At 25, she was independent and determined, though still carrying emotional scars from our turbulent family history. Tyler, always the calmest and most reflective, decided to study history and dreamed of being a university professor. As for me, I continued in the hospital laundry supervision, a job I performed with pride. There was something deeply satisfying about transforming chaos into order, dirt into cleanliness, perhaps a reflection of what I tried to do with my own life. In the evenings and on weekends, I maintained my small sewing business, which had become known in the region for my delicate embroidery, inspired by the 5 towns where I lived my different lives. We now lived in a modest but comfortable house that I managed to buy after years of saving. It had a small garden in the back where I grew herbs and flowers. Claire grew up happy, dividing her time between our house and that of Joaquin and Lucille, who had no other children and treated my youngest with all the love in the world. In 1995, when Claire turned 15, we organized a small party to celebrate. Nothing extravagant. We didn't have money for that, but full of affection. Joaquin and Lucille helped with the preparations and invited some friends from their family. Among the guests was a gray-haired gentleman who seemed vaguely familiar to me. It was only when he approached to serve himself at the dessert table, standing just a few steps from me, that I recognized him. It was Nelson, the professor, my 4th husband. My heart raced. I hadn't seen him since the trial, 14 years earlier. He seemed to have aged much more than time would justify. Completely white hair, deep wrinkles on his face, shoulders bent by the weight of years I imagined had been difficult. Our gazes met, and I saw the exact moment he recognized me. His eyes widened. The coffee cup he held trembled slightly in his hand. For an instant, I thought he would turn his back and leave, or worse, make a scene at my daughter's party. Instead, after a moment of hesitation, he approached. "Regina," he said, using the false name I had adopted with him. Or should I say Eleanor? "Eleanor is fine," I responded, my voice almost disappearing. "Nelson, I didn't expect to see you here. I'm a colleague of Joaquin's at the university now." "I teach literature in the humanities department," he explained without smiling. "He invited me. I didn't know that the birthday girl was your daughter." A heavy silence settled between us. So many things I wanted to say, so many requests for forgiveness that never had a chance to be expressed. "She's beautiful," he finally commented, looking at Claire, who danced cheerfully with friends across the room. "Looks a lot like you." "Thank you," I murmured, not knowing how to respond to what seemed to be a compliment. Nelson took a sip of his coffee, then stared at the dark liquid for a moment, as if seeking words in the depths of the cup. "You know, I spent many years angry," he finally said. "Angry at you, angry at myself for being so easily deceived. I lost trust in people, became bitter, isolated." My heart tightened. More damage I had caused, another life I had negatively affected with my lies. "I'm sorry," I said, knowing the words were absolutely insufficient. "If I could go back—" "I'm not here to hear apologies," he interrupted me, but without aggression. "I'm here because, after many years, I realized that carrying that hatred was destroying me more than your lies ever could. I needed to learn to forgive, not for you, but for myself." At that moment, Tyler approached us, curious about the stranger with whom I was conversing so intensely. "Mom, is everything okay?" he asked, placing his hand protectively on my shoulder. "Yes, dear. This is an old acquaintance, Nelson. Nelson, this is my son, Tyler." The two men greeted each other, and I saw Nelson's eyes study my son's face with curiosity. "You teach at the university, don't you? I think I've attended a lecture of yours on American literature. It was fascinating," Tyler commented, always polite. "Yes, I've been a professor there for over 20 years, Nelson responded, seeming surprised and flattered by the recognition. "Tyler is studying history," I explained. "He always said he wanted to be a teacher like you." The words came out before I could think about what I was saying. Nelson looked at me astonished. "Like me?" "It's a long story," I replied, averting my gaze. Tyler, sensing the tension, made a polite excuse and walked away, leaving us alone again. "You talked about me to your children?" Nelson asked, the surprise evident in his voice. "They knew everything, Nelson. After the scandal, after the trial, there was no way to hide it. And yes, I mentioned you. I talked about your passion for teaching, your knowledge, your impressive library. Tyler was just a child, but somehow those stories marked him." Nelson remained silent, processing the information. Finally, a sad smile appeared on his lips. "Life has a strange way of closing circles, doesn't it? Maybe I was still a positive influence, despite everything." The conversation was interrupted when Claire came running, radiant, to show me a gift she had just received. Seeing Nelson, she stopped, curious. "Who are you, sir?" she asked, with the frankness typical of adolescence. Before I could respond, Nelson stepped forward. "I'm an old friend of your mother's," he said, extending his hand. "And a professor at the university where your brother studies, Nelson Reynolds." "Oh, the literature professor! Tyler talks about you a lot," Claire exclaimed, shaking his hand enthusiastically. "He says your classes are the best." Nelson seemed genuinely touched. After Claire walked away to return to the party, he turned to me. "I think I need to go," he said, placing the empty cup on the table. "It was unexpected meeting you today, Eleanor, but perhaps it was necessary, a closing of a cycle." "Nelson," I called, as he was already turning to leave. "I really am sorry for everything." He nodded without saying anything and walked away, disappearing among the guests. That brief encounter with Nelson affected me deeply. For years, I had tried to block the memories of the men I deceived, focusing only on rebuilding my life and raising my children with honesty. But there, at that party, the past had come knocking at my door again. In the following weeks, I found myself thinking more and more about the other men. How were Anthony, Gerald, and Sebastian? Had they found happiness despite the pain I caused? Had they managed to forgive, as Nelson seemed to have done? The curiosity grew until it became almost an obsession. One day, I made a decision that surprised even myself. I would seek them out one by one to personally ask for forgiveness. I didn't expect absolution or reconciliation, just the chance to show that I recognized the harm I had done and that after all those years, I still carried the weight of guilt. I shared my plan with Ryan, now a respected young doctor, expecting him to dissuade me from the idea. Instead, after a long, reflective silence, he said, "I think you should do it, Mom. not for them, but for you, to finally close this chapter. We started with Anthony, the grocery store owner, my first husband after the abandonment. I discovered he still lived in Millfield, though the grocery store had closed years before. Now, almost 80, he lived with a niece who cared for him. The visit was difficult. Anthony had suffered a second stroke that left him partially paralyzed and with difficulty speaking. When I entered the small room where he spent his days, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of surprise and something I couldn't identify, anger, sadness, or perhaps just confusion. "Hello, Anthony," I said, sitting in the chair beside his bed. "It's me, Eleanor." He didn't respond, just continued staring at me. "I came to ask for forgiveness," I continued, determined to say what I had rehearsed so many times. "For what I did to you, for the lies, for the suffering I caused. I know words can't undo the damage, but I wanted you to know I never stopped regretting it." A long silence followed, interrupted only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant sound of the television in the living room. Finally, with visible effort, Anthony moved his hand unaffected by the stroke and extended it in my direction. Hesitantly, I took it between mine. "Water under the bridge," he murmured with the slurred speech characteristic of someone who had suffered a stroke. "Don't carry it anymore." Tears filled my eyes. I didn't expect forgiveness, much less that unexpected kindness. "Thank you," I whispered, gently squeezing his hand. Before leaving, I showed him photos of my children, the 3 older ones he had briefly known, and Claire, who was born after our separation. I told him about their achievements, about how they had become responsible and good adults despite their mother's mistakes. He listened to everything in silence, with a small smile on his immobile lips. The meeting with Gerald, the shoe manufacturer, was very different. He had moved to New York City after the scandal, starting over from scratch. Now he owned a moderately successful chain of shoe stores. Ryan accompanied me on the visit, both to give me moral support and to intervene if things got out of control. Gerald received us in his office in the city center, an elegant space that reflected his business success. At 60, he kept himself in shape, well-dressed, with just a few white strands in his dark hair. When I entered, his eyes narrowed, but he maintained his composure. "Eleanor," he said, pronouncing my real name with a slight ironic emphasis. "Or should I call you Celia? I was never sure which was the lie and which was the truth with you." "Eleanor is my real name," I replied, without reacting to the provocation. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Gerald." "Curiosity, more than anything else," he shrugged. "I wanted to see what you had to say after so many years." "And who is this young man?" he asked, looking at Ryan. "My son, Dr. Ryan Thompson," I introduced, noting the gleam of pride in my son's eyes at being called doctor. "He's a physician at St. Vincent Hospital now." "A doctor, huh?" Gerald commented, evaluating Ryan with new eyes. "Well, at least something good came out of all that mess." The conversation that followed was tense but civilized. Gerald told me that after the scandal, he immersed himself in work to forget the humiliation. He married a few years later to an accountant who helped him expand the business. They had 2 children, now teenagers. "You know, in the end, I think I should even thank you," he said with a dry laugh. "If I hadn't discovered your lies in that dramatic way, I'd probably still be in that small town, with that small factory, dreaming of a life that would never come." "Still, I'm sorry," I insisted. "What I did was inexcusable." "It was," he agreed bluntly. "But life goes on. I moved on. You apparently did too. I don't hold a grudge, Eleanor, or forgiveness, to be frank, just acceptance that the past is the past." When we said goodbye, Gerald shook my hand with professional firmness, as he would with any client or supplier. There was no warmth in that gesture, but also no hostility, just the neutrality of someone who had truly moved on. Sebastian, the fabric merchant, was the hardest to find. After several attempts, we discovered he had moved to the south, to his family's homeland in Georgia. Unfortunately, we also discovered he had died 3 years earlier, the victim of a sudden heart attack. Instead of him, I found his sister, Mrs. Teresa, who had cared for him in his final years. When I identified myself, I expected hostility, but I was greeted with surprising tranquility. "Sebastian spoke of you a few times in recent years," she said, serving me coffee on the porch of her simple home in Atlanta. Not with bitterness, but as someone who finally understood the circumstances. "How so?" I asked, confused. After he came back here, Sebastian got involved with volunteer work at a shelter for single mothers. I think listening to those women's stories, the desperation, the lack of options, the struggle to support their children, he began to understand a little of what might have led you to do what you did. I remained silent, absorbing that unexpected information. "Before he died, he asked me to give you something if you ever appeared, Mrs. Teresa continued, getting up to fetch something from inside the house. She returned with a small package, carefully wrapped in brown paper. When I opened it, I found a book of poetry, the same one Sebastian had given me at our first meeting, when I introduced myself as Carmen, the seamstress with Spanish heritage. On the first page, a dedication written with a trembling hand, dated 1992. "To Eleanor, or Carmen, as I knew you. If one day this book returns to your hands, know that I learned to forgive. Life is too short to carry grudges. Sebastian." Tears flowed freely down my face as I pressed the small book against my chest. A forgiveness I never expected, coming from someone who could no longer receive my personal thanks. Those visits to the men from my past, those I could find, brought me a sense of closure I didn't know I so desperately needed. They didn't erase what I did, didn't eliminate the guilt, but allowed me to look back without the weight of the past completely crushing me. In 1997, 2 years after the encounter with Nelson and the subsequent visits to the other men, I received an invitation that left me genuinely surprised. Nelson was retiring from the university and organizing a small celebration for former students and colleagues. Among the guests was my name. I hesitated a lot before accepting. I didn't want to revive painful memories, didn't want to cause embarrassment. It was Tyler who convinced me to go. "He wouldn't invite you if he didn't really want your presence, Mom," he argued. "Besides, he was one of the best professors I ever had. I'd like you to be there with me." The party was held in the university library, a place that perfectly matched Nelson, surrounded by books, knowledge, the world he so loved. When I arrived, accompanied by Tyler, several curious glances turned to us. Clearly, some of those present knew our history. Nelson came to greet us personally, with a dignity I always admired in him. "Eleanor, Tyler, thank you for coming," he said with a genuine smile. "It means a lot to me." During the ceremony, several former students spoke about how Nelson had influenced their lives and careers. Tyler was one of them, moving everyone by telling how the literature classes had taught him to look at my story with more human eyes, to see beyond facts and dates, to find the real people behind events. When it was Nelson's turn to speak, he surprised everyone with a speech not about literature or education, but about forgiveness. "The greatest lesson I learned in 4 decades of teaching," he said, "didn't come from books, but from life. I learned that carrying resentments is like drinking poison, expecting the other person to die. True knowledge comes when we understand that all of us, are capable of terrible mistakes and also extraordinary redemption." His eyes met mine briefly, and in that instant, I knew his words were as much for me as for himself. At the end of the evening, when the guests were already dispersing, Nelson approached me with a small package in his hands. "I wanted you to have this," he said, handing me the package. "In a way, it was always yours." Inside, I found a first edition of To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, the book we were reading together when everything collapsed. On the title page, a simple dedication, "To New Beginnings." That gesture, more than any word, sealed a cycle of forgiveness that had begun 2 years earlier at my daughter's 15th birthday party. We weren't friends, nor would we be, but we had found a form of peace with our shared past. In the years that followed, I maintained sporadic contact with Nelson, mainly through Tyler, who considered him a mentor. I learned that he published several books after retirement, traveled the world giving lectures, fully lived the golden years we all deserve. As for the others, Anthony passed away in 1999, peacefully, according to his niece who informed me by letter. Gerald continued expanding his businesses, and occasionally I saw news about him in economic newspapers. And I continued my simple, honest life, surrounded by my children and eventually grandchildren. Claire grew up strong and determined, studied law, and specialized in defending women in vulnerable situations. A career choice she once told me was inspired by my story, by the mistakes and successes of my journey. The past never completely abandons us. It lives in us, in the visible and invisible scars we carry, in the lessons we learn the hard way. But it doesn't have to define us forever. There's always a chance to rewrite the next chapter of our story with more wisdom, more compassion, both for others and for ourselves. The early 2000s brought significant changes to my life. I officially retired from supervising the hospital laundry in 2002, at 65, after almost 2 decades of service. The farewell was emotional, with a small celebration organized by the staff who had grown under my supervision. Sister Constance, then over 80, and already removed from the convent's administrative functions, made a point of attending. "When you arrived here, Eleanor, you were a broken woman seeking redemption," she told me, holding my wrinkled hands in hers, even more marked by time. "Today, you leave as an example of transformation and perseverance." Her words moved me deeply. Of all the people I met throughout my life, Sister Constance was the one who extended her hand at the darkest moment when everyone else turned their backs. My path could have taken a much more tragic turn. Retirement, however, didn't mean inactivity. I continued with my small home sewing workshop, now focused mainly on artistic embroidery and small repairs. Manual work was always therapeutic for me. Each stitch, each line carefully sewn, represented a small act of creation, of bringing order to chaos, beauty to the ordinary. My children were all set in life. Ryan, at 36, was a respected doctor specializing in pulmonology, a choice influenced by the pneumonia he suffered in childhood that indirectly triggered my entire saga of parallel lives. He had married Anna, also a doctor, and they had a small son, Michael, my first grandson. Melissa, at 34, had become a talented graphic designer, working at a children's book publisher. She remained single by choice, dedicated to her career and social causes, especially related to children in vulnerable situations. Tyler, at 32, pursued an academic career, becoming a university history professor specializing in the civil rights era. He married young to his college girlfriend, Patricia, and they had twins, Lucy and Sophie, my little granddaughters of 5. Claire, my youngest born in the eye of the hurricane, graduated from law school with honors and at 22 was already working at a firm specializing in women's rights. Her relationship with her father, Joaquin, remained strong and affectionate. He and Lucille were constant presences in her life and, by extension, in mine. It was through Claire that my life took an unexpected turn in 2003. She had started working on a legal assistance project for women in vulnerable situations, single mothers, victims of domestic violence, women in precarious socioeconomic conditions. One day, she came home visibly disturbed. "I met a woman today, Mom," she told me, sitting heavily at the kitchen table while I prepared dinner. Young, with 3 small children, abandoned by her husband, without family support. She's desperate, thinking of things she shouldn't, to try to survive. I stopped what I was doing, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The situation described was painfully familiar. I tried to help her with what I can offer legally, child support, access to social programs, but it's so little, so slow, Claire continued, the frustration evident in her voice. And while the system drags on, the children go hungry. I remained silent, memories of my own desperation, decades ago, surfacing with an intensity I didn't expect. You know what she told me? Claire went on, her voice breaking. That she was thinking of accepting a married man's proposal to be his mistress in exchange for financial help. She said she would do anything for her children, anything. Those words hit me like lightning. How many times had I thought the same? How many times had I justified my choices with the same phrase, I would do anything for my children? What do you think I should tell her, Mom? Claire asked, looking at me with those eyes so similar to Joaquin's, sincere, compassionate, seeking answers that weren't simple. I sat down beside her, breathing deeply. For years I had kept my story as something private, shared only with family and a few close friends. The scandal of the 5 lives had diluted with time, becoming at most an old anecdote that few still remembered. But at that moment, I realized that perhaps my experience, both the mistakes and the redemption, could serve a greater purpose. Bring her here, I finally said. I want to talk to her. The following week, Claire brought Deborah, a 24-year-old woman with deep circles under her eyes and a look I knew all too well. The look of someone at the edge of the abyss, contemplating desperate leaps. Her 3 children, ages 6, 4, and 2, painfully reminded me of mine at the same age, when I was left alone. We talked for hours. I told her my entire story without omitting anything. The initial desperation, the terrible choices I made, the bitter consequences, but also the slow and painful reconstruction, the possible redemption, despite everything. I'm not here to judge your choices, I told her, holding her trembling hands between mine. I know better than anyone how desperation can lead us to paths we never imagined treading, but I want you to know there are other ways out, difficult, slow, imperfect, but that don't destroy your soul in the process. That same night, impulsively, I offered Deborah a job in my small workshop, not much, a few hours a week helping with simple sewing, while the children stayed in the space I adapted at the back of the house. But it was a start, something honest, something that would allow her to maintain dignity while seeking more permanent alternatives. In the weeks that followed, I taught her the basics of sewing. Deborah proved skillful and, more importantly, determined to learn. Claire, in parallel, managed to expedite her child support process and enroll her in government assistance programs. Ryan offered to treat the children for free. Melissa designed simple flyers, advertising our sewing services in the community. What began as an impulsive gesture to help a young mother gradually transformed into something bigger. Other women in similar situations, Deborah's friends, Claire's cases, referrals from social workers at the hospital, began appearing at my door. For each one, I told my story, offered what I could in terms of temporary work, training, guidance. By mid-2004, what had begun as a sewing workshop in my living room had expanded to a small community center in the neighborhood, using a space provided by the local parish. We named the project New Beginnings, a name that echoed the dedication Nelson had given me in the book years before. The center offered training in sewing, crafts, and other manual skills that allowed flexible work for single mothers. We also had a space for children, volunteer legal guidance coordinated by Claire, and basic medical care once a week organized by Ryan. Tyler gave literacy classes to women who hadn't completed their studies, and Melissa coordinated art workshops for the children. Deborah, our first student, became my assistant and eventually co-coordinator of the project. Seeing her transformation from a desperate young woman on the verge of self-destructive choices to a confident and capable woman brought me a joy I can't describe. It was Joaquin who surprisingly took the next crucial step for the project. During one of the regular visits he made to see Claire and follow the development of New Beginnings, he called me for a private conversation. "I've been observing what you've been doing here, Eleanor," he said with the frankness that was always characteristic of him. "It's important, necessary work, but I think it could reach more people." He explained he was about to retire from the private clinic where he worked and wanted to invest part of his savings in something meaningful. He proposed formalizing New Beginnings as an official nonprofit with its own space, proper equipment, and capacity to serve more women. "Why?" I asked, genuinely surprised by the offer. Despite years of civilized coexistence because of Claire, Joaquin and I had never exactly been friends. "Because I saw what desperation did to you decades ago," he answered simply. "And I see how you've transformed that experience into something that helps others not fall into the same abyss. It's the kind of legacy I'd like to support." With Joaquin's initial investment and the tireless work of everyone involved, New Beginnings grew significantly. In 2007, we moved to our own headquarters, a renovated old factory with enough space for workshops, childcare, offices, and even a small store where we sold products made by the women in the project. At the center of this growth, to my surprise, was my personal story. What for so many years I considered my greatest shame, the 5 parallel lives, the lies, the scandal, became a powerful tool to connect with women in vulnerable situations. I wasn't just someone who said I understood their desperation. I was someone who had lived desperation in its most extreme form and found a way back. In 2010, at 73, I received an invitation I never would have expected. The university where Tyler taught was organizing a symposium on women, motherhood, and economic survival, and they wanted me to be one of the main speakers. At first, I refused, terrified by the idea of publicly speaking about my past. But my children insisted. "Your story has power, Mom," said Claire. "Power to show that paths aren't linear, that mistakes aren't definitive, that redemption is possible." I reluctantly accepted. The night before the lecture, I barely slept, tormented by nightmares where I was again judged, humiliated, exposed. The morning of the event, Tyler found me in the kitchen, drinking tea to calm my nerves. "Are you ready?" he asked, sitting beside me. "How can anyone be prepared to expose their worst mistakes before hundreds of strangers?" I replied, trying to smile despite the fear. "It's not your worst mistakes you're going to expose," he said, holding my hand. "It's your complete journey. The mistakes are just the beginning of the story, not the end." Those words accompanied me when I took the stage a few hours later, facing an auditorium packed with students, professors, and, to my surprise, many of the women who had passed through New Beginnings over the years. Deborah was in the front row, smiling encouragingly. I told my complete story, from abandonment by my first husband to the creation of the project. I spoke of the mistakes, the consequences, the scars that remained even after decades. But I also spoke of the possibility of starting over, of transforming pain into purpose, of using the darkest experiences as light to guide others. "Desperation can take us to places we never imagined," I said, concluding my talk. "It can make us unrecognizable even to ourselves, but it's not our final destination. We can fall, we can completely lose ourselves, but we can also find the way back, not to who we were before, but to someone wiser, more compassionate, more complete." The applause that followed was deafening. But what really touched me were the women who came to speak with me afterwards. Young mothers struggling to balance studies and motherhood, middle-aged women who had gone through devastating divorces, elderly women who recognized in my words echoes of their own journeys of overcoming. That lecture was a watershed. In the following years, I was invited to speak at other events, universities, and even at a national conference on public policies for women. New Beginnings gained visibility, attracting donations, volunteers, and most importantly, women who needed support. In 2015, the story of the project and my personal history became the subject of a documentary produced by journalism students. 5 Lives, 1 Redemption was shown at minor festivals and won a small award in the social documentary category. Seeing my life portrayed on screen was a surreal experience, especially when the film showed artistic recreations of my 5 lives in the 1970s. At 78, looking back, I see a journey I never could have imagined. From the depths of desperation and lies to creating a legacy of hope and transformation. From social judgments and condemnations to speaking in packed auditoriums. From deep shame to renewed purpose. My grandchildren, I now have 6, know my entire story, not as a shameful secret whispered in corners, but as an open narrative of fall and redemption. Michael, Ryan's son, followed his father's footsteps into medicine and frequently volunteers at New Beginnings. Tyler's twins, Lucy and Sophie, now 20, are in college, one studying social work, the other psychology. Claire has a 10-year-old daughter, Laura, who already says she wants to be a lawyer to help women like Grandma helps. Joaquin, an unlikely partner in this journey of redemption, passed away in 2018 at the age of 79. In his will, he left a significant sum to ensure the continuity of New Beginnings. His funeral gathered not only relatives and medical colleagues, but dozens of women and children who had passed through the project over the years. A silent testimony to the impact our unlikely collaboration had generated. Nelson, the professor who re-encountered me at Claire's 15th birthday party, maintained sporadic contact over the years, mainly through Tyler. I learned from my son that he followed the development of New Beginnings from afar and had mentioned our story in his last memoir in a respectful and reflective way. When the book was published, he sent me an autographed copy with a single phrase: "The most important stories are those of redemption. Thank you for sharing yours." As for Anthony, Sebastian, and Gerald, the other men I deceived so many years ago, their fates followed diverse paths. Anthony and Sebastian had already passed away when I began New Beginnings. Gerald, I learned by chance, sold his chain of stores and moved to Europe, where he opened a small artisanal shoe business. Word reached me, through mutual acquaintances, that he had seen the documentary about my story and simply commented, "She finally found her way." Today, sitting here in front of this camera, telling my story to you, I feel a mixture of emotions. Shame for the mistakes I made. Yes, that never completely disappears. But also gratitude for the journey, for the lessons learned, for the chance to transform a fractured life into something with meaning and purpose. I'm not a saint. I'm not a model of virtue. I'm just a woman who fell deeply, who got lost in lies and desperation, but who found a way back, not to innocence, which is lost forever, but to authenticity, which is perhaps more valuable. If my story can touch just one person who's at rock bottom right now, if it can show that even from the darkest places it's possible to find light, then it will have been worth sharing it. And to those who judge, and there will always be those who judge, I can only say, pray you never know the kind of desperation that makes unthinkable paths seem like the only possible exits. And if you ever do know it, remember my story. Not as justification for wrong choices, but as proof that there's always a way back to the light, however long and difficult it may be. Thank you for listening to me, for not judging me, for allowing this 78-year-old woman to share not just her mistakes, but also her redemption. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone who might need to hear about second chances, and always remember, our worst fall doesn't have to be our final destination. Oh, and don't forget to tell me in the comments which part of my story touched you the most. I'm looking forward to reading and responding to each of you.